Hey, thank you for having me. What I plan to do for you today is walk you through a process that I built for one of our users. I am the Associate Vice President for Technology Innovation at Texas State University. And I thought this, what I'm going to share with you, was a great example of how you bring together um, little pieces of the 365 Power Platform ecosystem to help people achieve their goals in a rather simple manner. And all of this stuff is built on our A5 licensing, which is the academic equivalent of your E5 licensing. Took about, I don't know, handful of hours to build this, including customer interviews and feedback. So let's take a look. So for me, this is all about digitizing business processes, right? And how do we effectively and quickly achieve that? So one of the things I find with our users is that oftentimes when you talk with them and you're trying to investigate for them what's going on, how you can help their processes, it's a little bit harder for them to imagine. So typically start with two things, either things that are web forms or things that they handle via email. So those are their most common points of contact with our customer base. And so this particular group uh, that I work with was handling travel requests. So there is one admin assistant for a whole department at one of our remote campuses that handles all the travel requests. Even if it's personal travel, you have to get authorization because you have to figure out who's going to cover your time slots as a faculty member or as a staff member. And then there is business travel, and then there was business combined with personal travel, because why not go when somebody's already paid for the majority of things? So just tag on some personal days to that. So in their current scenario, the travelers send a request via email to the admin. The admin reads through the email, sends it through the chair. The chair approves or denies. The admin replies to the requester, and then an Outlook folder holds all these different records. And at some point, they're moved to SAP Concur, which is our travel system. This solution does not include any customizations that move stuff into SAP Concur, but still, takes care of the whole rest of things. So I thought I would give you a quick overview. In our scenario, there will be one data source that will hold all the information for travel requests. And whenever a new request lands in the system, it will be set to new, and then they will be processed into approvals or denials. And the interface that we thought would be most useful, this was after conversation with them, was to create something similar to a Kanban board that would display all the requests. And then as they get moved from one status to another one, they will change into different buckets or different lanes like you do in a Kanban board. So the solution pieces here, there's a user that fills in a Microsoft form. We have some internal forms that our web team designed that unfortunately all they do is capture data, but there's no integration points with those forms. So part of the conversation is moving away from our in-house built forms and start taking advantage of Microsoft Forms. So when a user submits the form, then that form gets processed by Power Automate. So I'll do a very small overview of that because you're going to see that in the next presentation, next meeting. And from there, two things happen. One of them is the administrator gets an email saying that a new request has arrived, so they don't always have to have the solution open. And then the information gets moved to a SharePoint list over which a Power App is built, and the administrator uses, the department administrator uses the Power App to process the information, and it automatically gets back via Outlook to the requester. So we eliminate a whole bunch of points of contacts and clicks and movings and stuff like that with it. So this is, again, a recap of that, but we use the Microsoft form to initiate the requirement, and we use one form for all modes of travel. So we use the branching criteria in the Microsoft form for either business travel or personal travel while traveling for business. We also use estimated costs, which was hard to track in the past. And we take advantage of the fact that we can make the forum only available to the members of the department. So even when they link it to external sites, the authentication with the university's Active Directory only makes it available to those department members. So when the form is submitted, it triggers the Power Automate. A new record is created in the SharePoint list, and Outlook emails the chair and the admin about the request. And the email includes a link to the Power App, so they don't even have to go looking for it in their browser. And then they process a request. So one of the things that we added to it is also the system calculates the expected cost of the travel and adds it to the budget in the PowerApps in the SharePoint list. And then when they get denied or approved, there's an email that goes out. So this is a drawing for those of you who are visual learners. Our data source is that SharePoint list, and it's a single table. And then once the SharePoint list receives the data, it really displays in PowerApps galleries, which are lists of submissions. And basically all that we do with this is filter things based on criteria. So you can see things that are pending, approved, or denied, or you can see all. And basically, all these forms are looking at the same data source, or all these galleries are looking at the same data source. All they're doing is filtering the information based on approval status. But I will show this in a minute, but I guess I would stop and ask, get some thumbs up. So how many of you are familiar with PowerApps to begin with? All right, so we have a few of you who are familiar with PowerApps, so you're probably familiar with the standard criterion of, when we have a form in PowerApps, we populate its content with whatever item we have selected in a gallery. But there's a problem here because we have 4 galleries, and we want to populate that one form that we will use to process the response with the content of potentially up to 4 galleries. So that was a little bit of a little interesting brain teaser. So yeah, how do we do that, right? So the way we do that, I think that was gratuitous, is to use variables. And in PowerApps, you can use variables to store all sorts of things. But of particular interest is the fact that we can store records in a variable. So I'll show you in a moment how we leverage that for the solution, right? So the key function that we will be using is using the onSelect property of each gallery. And we're going to set a variable called selected record. And we're going to fill that variable or populate that variable with the item that is being selected in the gallery. And then we're going to bring up a form that is sitting in the background as a pop-up. And we're going to set its content to that variable. So quick overview. I think I'll actually show you this. I was going to say, or let's walk through this. In creating the form, one of the things to keep in mind is I'm talking about the web form at this point that we're going to use to collect the information. A key component to the way I architected this solution was to then make sure that you create a SharePoint that will receive the form data, SharePoint list, to catch all the relevant data, the key info from that form. So mapping your form fields to the proper columns in a SharePoint list. In our case, we added additional columns because the process then will hold how much the actual approval was and the status, which is something that the form doesn't catch. We don't ask the users to create the status, right? And then one thing to keep in mind is that for some strange reason, even though Microsoft Forms capture the user name and email if they authenticate into the form, when you move into Power Automate, you can still get the user's email, the person who filled this form, into Power Automate and map it against a SharePoint item, but you cannot get their name. I don't know why, but I've tried this 20 different times and it doesn't. So you have to still ask the user to enter their name. And we will see how we use a lot of if functions to take care of the process. But let's take a quick look actually on this thing live, right? So we're going to start actually here. Just a quick point of observation. If you go to Microsoft Forms, you can create a new form here at the top of the page. But if you are doing this for a group of people, you first have to go to the bottom and look at your different groups and decide, which group you're gonna handle this under. So, and this is important because then it lets several people manage the form instead of it being your personal form. So for example, I could go to Camp Garage and then create a group form there. So that's the way I did it for this group. So I'm going to show you the form that I created for them. Again, notice that I do ask them for their name. I try as much as possible to ask people for as little information as necessary. And it irritates me that I still have to ask them for their name because the system actually captures that. But here are the different fields that that they requested. For example, they wanted to have a trip title so that if one user has multiple trips in the system, they can refer easily to whatever trip that is by the title. This is where they enter their coverage plan. And then here is whether or not they specify if this is a personal trip or a business trip. So if we start filling this in, I'm in preview mode right now. And I want to go on some Mezcal research trip. And my coverage plan is not needed. Summer trip. So here, depending on my travel type, if I specify personal or I specify business, I'll get different follow-ups. So if I do business, so you notice it brings up this whole question of the destination, etc. And if I specify personal, it takes me to the end of the form, sort of when it starts, etc. So without going into, all this form, what we're using is branching. So depending on what kind of answer they provide here, there is a branch at the form that specify which section the user will jump next. I want to stop briefly to see if there are any questions. Okay, so this is the corresponding SharePoint list. And you notice I always leave the title empty. I don't like that, the use of the title section, but here's where we record email, traveler's name, title, etc. And there are different fields that are mapped here. You notice these are the costs of the form. And then as we get towards the end, actually, we added a couple of things here. For example, approval status, right? That was not part of the form. Here, SharePoint actually calculates the total cost of the fee of the trip if there is a cost associated with it, like you can see here and there. If there is no cost, it'll go to 0. And then we added also another field for approved funding. So they may ask for something, but they may get less. So we wanted to make sure that we could actually register how much of that funding was approved for them. Let's take a look at our Power Automate and how that works. Oops. Yeah, this is where SharePoint, where sharing screen gets in the way a little bit. So let's do that. Right, so here's the automation. It's a fairly simple one, but it has a couple of pitfalls associated with it. We use the trigger, simple one, when a form is submitted. That's going to be our trigger. But if you're using a group form, normally you can designate your form by this pull down here, and it will list all the forms that you have on your name. But with group forms, the way I've seen it is most of the time there is this custom value required. And that custom value is the form's ID. So if you look at the URL of the form, you have to copy from where after ID equals to the end of that until the and top view equals preview. That's your form ID. And that's what you need to populate that field with, okay? So I'm gonna have to rewrite it because I took it out. Oops, that's not it. Oh, come on. Let me get out of the other one so I don't do that much cut and paste. I'm not gonna save it. And so I'm gonna edit it again. So you need to tell it what to do after the form is submitted. And so this looks very similar. You have to enter that ID here as a custom value if it is not one of your personal forms. And then all you do is get a response ID. In the next step, then you tell it to create an item in SharePoint. And this is where you map your form items to your SharePoint list. So these don't have to match in name, but you have to have a catching place for each of them. So in this case, this is your SharePoint site, and then here you have your list name. And for all these, you map your form response fields to the different list items. And notice again, because the list has additional fields, sort of like comment of the administrator and approval status, and then approved funding, those don't need to be mapped. They just exist in the list. And finally, when that is submitted, the next step we tell it is to send the admin, in this case me, an email that is that in the body has the information for a simple summary information, if you wish, for that particular request. So the person is alerted to go ahead and go review that that request. Questions so far? Okay, so let's look at the Power App and, oh, all right, thanks, Sharon. Let's look at the Power App and see how it works, right? So here's the Power App in play mode, and I have received these 4 different pending requests. Adelita Montoya wants to go rob a train. Oh, actually, this was pending. I guess we never approved that because this was for May 7. So if I want to process that form, I just click here, and notice this is a business type form. So when I click on that, a container pops up and it shows me all the information Adelita has submitted. We don't want to edit most of that information. All we want to do is maybe deny that trip. Her estimated cost for the train robbery was 941. Since we're not going to approve it, she gets 0 funding. And then I can make a note. We need to have a discussion about this. And then once all of that is done, I can go ahead and submit it. And you notice that it moves directly to the denied ones, but I can also access it here if Adelita had multiple requests. They would appear all here. I can clear that information there, right? Even here, I may change my mind. And so I had denied Carlos's trip to Oaxaca. I'd actually think that, okay, I'm actually going to approve it and click on that. I want to bring up my email to show you then. And you see that whenever it changed status, Carlos received an email. I had not made any notes or approved any funding for it, but Carlos received an email. And here's the one that Adelita receives with the notes and the denial. So how do we wire all these pieces together? Let's take a look. So this Power App is built in as a single screen solution in tablet mode, and the decision to do that was to build this Power App as a web browser solution, so I always choose the sort of horizontal layout. It makes more efficient use of space. So we're going to create part of this again in a new screen. So when I start PowerApps, I can go and start a new screen. Let's see, where is that these days? There. And then I come here, sorry, down here, and I want to add data. So SharePoint. And connect to my data source. So I know that in this case, my travel requests are stored in my shared sample data, and look at my lists, and it is there. I'm not gonna click connect because I've already got it connected there, but that's essentially what happens at that point, right? You connect your data. All you've done is connect your Power App to the data source. Then we insert a gallery. I'm going to make it simple. So it's going to be a vertical gallery. And I'm going to connect this vertical gallery to my data source, and it will try to guess best it can how I want it shaped. So I'm going to change this. And I want to say that in the top field, I want to get the traveler's name. And actually, one thing to avoid in SharePoint, I usually try not to use the name field because it creates some confusion. So I try to be more specific. All right, so for the subtitle, and I use the trip title, and then I'm going to change actually here to also add a body and no images. So let's see if it doesn't mess me up. Well, it did. When I change the layouts, it tends to reset things. So let's go again for title for traveler name, subtitle, trip title, and then I want to have my date. So where would that be? Of our I'm gonna put just for it. So we can put return date for the ones where we have it. All right, so that's a simple thing. I'm going to remove these icons there because they don't help me. And I'm going to make this a little bit shorter. But this is essentially a gallery that would show me all the trip requests. And I'm going to make that one the template fill. I'm a big fan of Navajo White, so I'm going to make that. Now I want to have one that shows me the pending ones. So the easy step from this one is to just copy that and paste it. And add a filter. So I'm going to filter that same source where the trip status or the approval status equals pending. Right, so you can see here that it's showing just a part of that and not all of them. So you can start seeing how these different things mirror the experience we have there. This is the one that shows everything, and these are copies of it with different color backgrounds where we are filtering. So here are our denies, and we are filtering here based on approval status equals denied. I have added a search function that covers this input box, and I have added a sort function by the date when the request was created. Questions so far? Okay, so one of the things you may notice is that even though all of these things are supposed to be copies from each other, we have different items in the different cards based on their status. So the pending items, which are again filtered by pending approval status, we look at this icon here, and the icon property is currently set there to icon pin. But here, the icon property is set to icon check. And I didn't change anything from this side to this side. When they move, the icon actually changes as a conditional. Same thing. Same thing with this item and this item. What I was talking about earlier, though, is probably the most important part about this is what happens, how do we store the information about a request into a variable so that it can be processed via a pop-up form. So there are a couple of things to look at here. In the gallery itself, let's take a look at our unselect property, and you see here that when I select the property, this is the way you set a variable in PowerApps. Basically say set, give it a variable name, and then tell it what to store in that variable. So let's take a look. When I click here on this Solstice Research, I can go and look at my global variables, and the selected record has stored that information about that trip. So every time I click on an item in any of the galleries, I am storing that information in that variable. So if I go here, I can go back to the variable. And this one is the trip to Oaxaca there. That makes it possible then to populate a form. When I click on that, with that information. That form is stored in a container, but let's take a look at the form itself. One of the specifications of creating a form is what item we're going to display in that form. So if we look here at the item property, this is where that variable comes into play, because now this single form is not associated with a specific gallery, but it's drawing information from whatever's stored in the form. So how are we bringing this form up? This form lives in a container rather than in a different screen. And when I click again into any of these items, the other thing I'm doing is I am setting another variable, which is a view requests, and that's what brings up the form. And I'm resetting that form first, and I'm setting that form later into edit mode. So this container, there's a container, you cannot see it, you only see the outline. It's visible property is called view requests. And if we look at that property right now, we can see that it is set to false right there. So it means that we cannot view it, but the minute we click on the item, we will set it to true, and we will then view the form with its content in it. The form has two buttons. One button resets the form if we change our mind, and it hides the whole container. But the other button has this very long if statement associated with it. And it says, if the status of the selected dropdown is set to approve, send this personalized email. But if the status is set to denied, then send a different kind of email. So even with this, it helps us personalize the email based on whether or not we approve the travel request. There's some additional things to note in the form. Let's take a look for a moment. So we have a personal trip here. If we look at the personal trip here, then it only has the form for approval or denial has only the fields that are relevant to that personal trip. Let's try to find another one here, right? This is all the information associated with a personal trip. And if we look at this business, that's a personal trip also. This one, the train robbery one, right? This one has all the different costs and additional information associated with a business travel rather than the ones associated with a personal trip. It is still the same form that's processing both things. Let's leave the form up. And what is happening here is that let's take a look at the form fields themselves. A lot of these fields have, let's look at the registration fee, right? So registration fee we're not seeing right now. And the reason we're not seeing that registration fee is that we have an if statement for the visible property of that field, right? So we basically hide fields that are associated with business travel or with personal travel based on their request type. So if for the selected record, the travel type is business, then we show the cost or the registration. But if it is not, why are we going to burden the user that with fields that had no information. So it was a little bit tedious to go through this whole process of showing and hiding the fields, but it creates overall a much better experience for our users.